All right, guys, we're ready to move ahead now with the next building up for bid today. We're going to look at the building by Le Corbusier, the building known as Villa Savoie. It's a private residence in Paris. Le Corbusier is Swiss-born, and he's going to carry the idea of form follows function into what he will describe his machine for living. So I don't have a 10 buildings that changed America episode. So I found some videos that will help you see how the building goes together. And I really want to focus on the 5 points of architecture, which is something that Le Corbusier wrote extensively about. I guess you can liken this very analytical thinker builder to the sculptor that we've studied from the classical period, Polyclitus. Polyclitus wrote about his Doryphorus and called it canon. So he's definitely a thinker kind of artist architect. So it's interesting that we have such great writing from him. His design aesthetic, guys, is going to influence just about every architect after him. So this is really influential stuff that you need to really understand. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to the videos, and then I'll see you right after we're done. All right, so guys, we finished watching the short little episodes on 5 points of architecture. I want to kind of fill in the blank for you from how we get from Louis Sullivan to the architecture of Le Corbusier. Basically, movements in Europe are going to look a little bit different than what they do look like in the U.S. This is an artwork by the artist that's in your image set, your architect that's in the image set, known by the name Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He is a German designer who is designing this Barcelona pavilion for an exhibition as early as 1911, and it's there in Barcelona today so that you can see a different or an alternate view of what architecture could be in the modern century. It looks like a contemporary building, doesn't it? Very much like something like the Kimball, right? With its very basic kind of limited decoration that emphasizes materials really above anything else. Continuous fluid spaces move from one to the other. And this is kind of the ultimate expression of form following function, in that nothing would be here to really embellish the experience. You would just move from space to space to space. I got to tell you, if somebody had just sat me down as a young architecture student and showed me this kind of conception, I think I would have been a lot more successful in thinking about modern spaces that I wanted to design. You engineers there who are still thinking about this idea, take a look at this little drawing here. I think this really helps you the most. This comes from a diagram from Frank Lloyd Wright's The Destruction of the Box, and that phrase is very, very helpful when you're trying to figure out how do you go to these modern spaces. In a lecture that he gave in Berlin, he demonstrated this very, very easily, and I'm going to show you step by step how we go from the left to the right. First, you start off with the 19th century idea of what architecture is. It's very much given over to the structural confines of the walls and the borders and the perimeters, the solids that really kind of define the integrity of the building. But by redefining that to be a box without corners, where you now have walls that open up that interior space, by now taking another step and moving those support walls into the core of the building and leaving cantilevers, a new word for your vocabulary today. Cantilevers basically are these long projections that are only anchored on one side of them, and they seem or give the effect of being like floating panels in space. They're only made possible by reinforced concrete. So I want you to add that to your to-do list, especially when you're talking about buildings like Villa Savoie or the Seagram's building that we'll talk about later, especially when we're talking about Frank Lloyd Wright, because this is his idea after all, right? So if you kind of think of holding your arm up like and sticking out in front of you, and you put your other arm supporting at the elbow, what you've just done is cantilevered your arm. So I hope that's an easy demonstration for you to visualize in your head. But this is going to become a building block of modern architecture, anchoring those cantilevers or cantilevering platforms on one side. The idea of screens is actually coming to Frank Lloyd Wright from the Japanese culture, which divides up space in tea houses and interior palaces in similar fashion, where you adjust what's needed spatially by simply shifting these screens around. And then now we have an architecture that's not really about solid, it's about void. It's about the space that's inside. And that's what you see right here. Cantilevered roof lines, screen walls, and fluid space that moves in and out. And it's no longer constricted by the idea of the box. So this is what is really behind Frank Lloyd Wright's thinking, and it's going to be pivotal to where we go next. So instead of focusing on the massive supports of walls or structure, modern architects began focusing on the continuity of spaces. And that's really helpful when we look at something a little bit later. Very helpful in understanding Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, what he was trying to accomplish here. Another style that explores these same ideas that you're going to see at Villa Savoie, De Stijl. It's a Dutch movement. We're going to look at Piet Mondrian's composition in red, blue, and yellow a little bit later. And you can see that it's a simplified modernist aesthetic. That's what you get in the Schroeder House by Gerrit Rietveld, who is also designing in a similar fashion, where he imagines these spaces as kind of wrapping around and rolling into each other. The reason I like showing you this, look at his neighbors. Oh my God. Those are Dutch houses, like, that have been there since the time of Rembrandt, and they're narrow and confined little boxes stacked up one on top of the other. Can you imagine living next door and seeing this house go up where you have fluid spaces that invite natural light in? The patron was very willing to turn over the entire design process to this architect. So what we get is something that expresses what Frank Lloyd Wright was trying to teach. So I want to highlight the fact, guys, very rarely at this time in history do we have an American architect giving lectures to German architects and to European architects. I mean, that whole transfer process was the other way around in the world of art at this time. So this is pretty influential. And right over here, you can see there's the Reitwald, the Schroeder House designed by Reitwald. So these ideas that seem very, very contemporary, they were being explored very, very early in the 20th century. So here you can see the two floors are divided up between functional spaces for living and spaces for entertaining. They simply wrap around each other with walls that are partitions that can be opened. There's a lot of sliding doors here, so you can have large spaces or you can make these more interior and small spaces that you needed. So I just really think that it's kind of cool to see that the innovations in architecture are also being explored in art at the same time. So we'll be looking at the style a little bit later, the style. In Germany, this movement was called the Bauhaus, and it only survives up until the year 1933. It's an innovative school for artists, architects, textile designers, every kind of person who would be associated with the applied arts. It's very forward thinking, so naturally it became a target of the Nazis who closed it down in 1933. This is the typical idea of an art school, right? This is the Courtauld Gallery in London, where you see building, building, building. You put your sculpture people over here, you put your architects here, you put your painters over here, and they never cross-pollinate, right? They're all distinct disciplines that don't really relate to one another. So this is the traditional academic approach to what you do. If you're going to go and be an art student, you follow one discipline. Not so at the Bauhaus. This is the latest version of it at the location in Dessau, where it moved. Basically, what you see is a studio block that is multi-storied, that has natural light that comes into all the floors, and that is perfect light for, people designing architecture, people working on painting, people working on textiles, and they literally worked elbow to elbow. If you had an idea that an architect had, it could be explored by someone who was a painter. And I should probably remind you that the director of the school right before it closed was Vasily Kandinsky, who's a painter that we're going to look at a little bit later. He shares his ideas about improvisation with everybody in the school, and it's really kind of a touchstone for development later on. The tradition of the Bauhaus, we'll look at a couple of plans here. I mean, this architecture looks very, very familiar to us because it almost looks like stuff that you would see being built in 1960. Guys, 1926 is when this building went up. So we owe a debt of gratitude to these designers. When you see these spaces, large, unopened, open spaces that are basically unrestricted by the walls, offices, of course, more offices and administrative parts of the complex. But the idea is that this is a great place for all the disciplines to get together and cross-pollinate. So you would have interior designers working here as well. And it's just a really interesting kind of experiment. The teachers of the Bauhaus are basically going to immigrate to the United States right after 1933. So unfortunately for Germany, this spells the end of kind of modern architecture for a while. But for us in America, it means we get some great art teachers who begin to kind of pass these lessons off to Americans who are ready and willing to listen. So in France, this style is called Purism. And I'm showing you Ferdinand Leger's view of the city. He reduces this cacophony of sounds that you might hear in a cityscape, this construction things that you might see, the signage, right? The people coming and going independently. This kind of machine aesthetic is exactly what we find at Villa Savoye, which is the work that we're talking about with Le Corbusier. This private home was a domestic home, you should make note. is something that you could compare to something like Monticello, right? Basically, Thomas Jefferson's domestic house is similar to this one. I thought it was interesting. You guys saw in the Khan Academy article that Le Corbusier talked about classical forms as being an inspiration for his level of refinement. So there is a strong connection between the classical world or the neoclassical world and what is now being reinterpreted as modern. So let's take a look. You've already watched the videos. I'm going to move ahead here to the 5 points plan. If you haven't made a note yet, you need to know what they are because this is revolutionary. You start with these structures called pilares. Those are columns. They are made of steel. They do the heavy lifting for the building, and they help us free up the space so that we don't have to have all these really thick, heavy walls. You move to a functional roof. I thought it was so cool and so green that whatever Le Corbusier took away from the site, he added back in some form of a garden terrace or a roof that could support that green space that we all need. Free floor plan basically allows you to manipulate where the walls need to be and this how the spaces need to be carved up. So it opens up a lot of opportunities for you to design everything a person living inside this place is going to need, right? And that's very intentional, very forward-thinking architecture, including all of that structure and planning. Long horizontal windows could be uninterrupted, providing the best illumination and ventilation. Part of the problem, guys, is that architecture prior to this point, it felt like man was cut off from his natural environment. If you think of the Industrial Revolution and Britain, for example, if you worked in a factory in London, imagine your day. You wake up in a box building that has no park or green space in it or around it. I mean, it was a city of stone. You walk to another box and you work inside a little container space. You do that all day long, sun up to sundown, and then you go home to a box. It's inhumane not to be able to see some of that green natural space. And that's the utopian kind of ideal that we're trying to address with all these innovations. The last of the 5 points here, 5 freely designed facades. This would allow basically any kind of configuration of the windows on the outside because the walls are not doing those heavy lifting anymore. That's all being done by that first point up there. So I think it's an innovative way to approach the kinds of spaces you wanted to create. Here you guys can see at the bottom of the page, that is artwork by Le Corbusier, or architecture. I want you to make a note of what it's called here. Do you see domino? Domino construction and reinforced concrete. If you look at the floor plan to the left, it kind of looks like a domino, right? If you're holding a domino with all those dots on it, that is the floor plan the guy wanted to use. And on the left, we see before Le Corbusier, big, thick, heavy walls with some like little bitty openings where you see boxy construction, and we don't see anything outside inside that space. With his plan, everything is opened up, right? The heavy lifting is being done on the inside. The horizontals are reinforced concrete. We can open up windows and open up spaces so that we don't feel so cut off inside that particular space. That's what Villa Savoye is. So I want you to see this kind of stuff. We look at it and we're like, ooh, so contemporary, right? No, it's modern. This is 1929, 1931. I think the best place you can go to see this kind of architecture today in Dallas is the Rachovsky House. These patrons have bequeathed a large collection of artwork to the DMA, and they've also opened the Rachovsky collection in the warehouse, some of you may be familiar with, but their place of residence, the Rachovsky House, has been converted into a museum. I can't take you on a field trip there because you can only go in groups of 10 or less. But you would be able to see some bits of their collection in a modern space like this. So I highly recommend it. The house is a machine for living in. Please don't forget that famous quote, because this is a living machine from top to bottom. What you can see too is that the machine was designed to fit the human, rather than have like a Victorian building that has 10-foot ceilings where you're like, half that size. It doesn't make sense to have all of that wasted space and keep the ceilings where they will fit the person, right? So that's what I wanted you to see down here. The modular plan, it's an anthropometric scale based on an Englishman with his arm raised. Le Corbusier explicitly used the golden ratio in his modular system for the scale of architectural proportion. Where did he get that idea from? The classical world. Very familiar with classical architecture. He likens his kind of refinement in your article to archaic temple building in Greece, to the building of the Parthenon, which is classical. He also celebrates innovation and machinery by showing you an old Model T and what was being built in 1921, a very refined vehicle. So I thought it was cool to see that vehicle drive into the basement of Villa Savoie, the first level, and that it was all meant to enshrine the kind of living they were doing in the modern world. So look at this green space. Brilliant, bright white decorations. They kind of celebrate a machine aesthetic. In your article, they even talked about some of these shapes looking like a cruise ship, and that kind of comparison Le Corbusier would have been just fine with. I mean, cruise ships were modern innovations that were meant for living an alternate way. So those shapes would be familiar. I just think it's kind of interesting that we're again seeing parallels in art and architecture. So I'll leave it there and we'll move on with your next piece of architecture. Thanks, guys.